and policy frameworks and narratives about child poverty and education, we are sure, will provide further compelling and important themes for our discussions. And I would like to remind everybody that this seminar series is funded by the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain, and we invite everybody to become a member of the society, a status that has many, many benefits, including receiving the Journal of Philosophy of Education. A final reminder, we are recording the event, so if you object to that, please note that we will write to us and we will omit your contribution if you do not wish to be included. Now, without further ado, I'm now going to introduce the first of our speakers today, namely my co-organizer, one of my co-organizers in the series, Professor Elaine Unterhalter. Now, Professor Elaine Unterhalter is Professor of Education and International Development at UCL Institute of Education. She works on themes concerned with gender, race and class inequalities and their bearing on education. Her specialist interests are the capability approach and human development in education in Africa, with a particular focus on South Africa. She is the author and editor of several books and papers on these themes. Her recent publications include critical reflections on public-private partnership and education, poverty, and global goals for gender equality, how people make policy happen. Her current concerns are with education, poverty, and global justice. And this month, she's launching an innovative framework for researchers and policymakers on how to engage with data to support change for gender equality in education. Today, Elaine is going to present on what do we talk about when we talk about children, poverty, and education. Welcome, Elaine.
Thanks very much, Lorella, and it's really nice to see people participating and to contribute to this discussion. I'm just going to share my screen and oh yeah, there we go. What I'm going to do in this presentation is think about the research, the way that researchers and the disciplinary frameworks they draw on make them particular kinds of interlocutors of policy. And the analysis I've built up, and it's been a dialogue with Judith and Lorella as we've reflected on the contributions to the seminar, is trying to draw out some of the issues that have emerged from the seminar. So this is a kind of reflection on where some of the themes Lorella's already summarized for you and some organization of those. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is try to draw out some of the agreements and differences in our discussions and disciplines as they've emerged over the 4 seminars we've had on children, poverty, and education. I'm going to consider the way in which I think I can see, and obviously I'm a partial formulator, a very partial formulator of this position because of my interest in the capability approach, but that I think the capability approach has some capacity to act as what I call a conceptual glue between some of the differences and disagreements and divergences of what the different disciplinary frameworks enable us to do in dialogue with policy. And then I want to try to develop further some ideas on the metric of justice. And I want to particularly pay attention to this kind of public-private interface on education in relation to children and particularly poor children. Okay, it seemed to me, as I've listened to the presentations over the last few months, that there are kind of 4 areas in which people seem to be talking in different dialects. And I'll just pull out some highlights of these themes. First, there's the question of who is we? Are we an inclusive group in which philosophers and sociologists and social policy people can talk to each other, or are we only selectively inclusive? And I think we've noted numerous times how the voices of poor children are only brought to us through mediated formulations. A second difference in dialogue is whether children are particular in relation to their level of needs, their kinds of rights, or the kinds of capabilities that are associated with children and childhood. Or are children so diversely located in so many intersecting and multifaceted sorts of relationships that it's impossible for us to formulate that? So is there, is there a special set of relationships in relation to education and a special liminality associated with those children's relationships? A third different set of dialogues is, how do we think of poverty? Is poverty material? Is income always the major, the major set of ways, the framework in which we have to think of it? Or are relational forms of poverty, shame, guilt, as important or could be more important? Is poverty intersectional? How important is the history and the forms of institution? Or do we have a way of thinking of all these things together? And lastly, is education protective against poverty? Is it discriminatory, or is it mixed? And how much or how little are teachers, parents, and their complexities part of the discussion, including in the prevailing policy discourses? So different people in the seminar series have spoken in different dialects and privileged different bits of that. And you might ask, okay, we're all engaged, we're all concerned with the same issues. What's the problem? So here are 2 problems. The first is the problem of the nature of the disciplinary frames. And I think the disciplinary frames, interestingly, do a couple of things that are different, and it's important to note that difference. From the perspective of sociologists and social policy writers and people working in education and international development, it's a very wide angle view. It takes in a lot, and it's and the more extensive the view, the more you can see and the more you can engage. And in this discussion, very interestingly, normative is often taken to mean social relationships. The normative is the institutional or the cultural. What the sociological, social policy kind of view of the issue seems to do also is put down markers about social justice issues. And I think I know this because I do this work myself. Because we're not immersed in the philosophical discussions, they are just markers, they're just outline. And I think that there might in our work be what I've called a kind of tacit engagement with ideal theory, that because it's there, it's not critically examined in the way that philosophers might do. And so that extensive wide angle view of the sociological frame contrasts, I think, with the intensive, close focus, logically argued view from philosophers, in which they might be addressing inequalities as a matter of justice, or drawing out our assumptions on why children or poverty are matters of concern. What are the goods of childhood? What is denied by poverty? And in this framework, normative generally means a concern with what is right or what is good. That's so that we're actually using the words normative in completely, in different ways. In the philosophical presentations, there's a very shorthand depiction of social relations or institutions. And that shorthand is being used to signal that what's being described is non-ideal situations. But for a person who works and reads a lot of data and thinks about it, it's not particularly problematized sociologically. So there's a way in which the problem of the disciplinary frames are different, and that maybe we can't well articulate them. So that's one problem. I think a second problem really sharply emerges about what's the metric of justice. And I think one could work this through in relation to the two different frames, but I haven't delved deep enough yet to do that. So firstly, is the metric of justice associated with income and lack of income and lack of resources? In the area of education and international development in which I work, this is often called a concern with vertical inequalities, the distributional questions. How much education? How much do children get? How much money do they have? How much money do schools have? So that's the one, is the metric of justice, income or resources? Or is the metric of justice outcomes? And that's addressing these horizontal inequalities, which I've sometimes called the inequalities of whom, associated with race, gender, sexuality, location, ethnicity, these horizontal inequalities in which shame seems to be, the literature on shame seems to be very prevalent, and children's relationships can be very discussed in relation to the injustices of outcomes and the forms of regard of children and the ways in which they're depicted. A third way to think about the metric of justice, and this I think has got might have particular traction in relation to schooling, is it about inequalities of processes? So that if we are to address process inequalities, who is involved in conversations? How are decisions made about the distribution? How are decisions made about how to address horizontal inequalities? Those process inequalities within schools or between the public and the private space, if that's the metric of justice, what is required seem to be a number of different moves to just those concerned with income, or thus just those concerned with distribution, or just those concerned with recognition or some form of outcomes. So I think that what is necessary, either if we take see that the disciplinary talking past each other, or the clusters of disagreement about what's the most salient metric of justice, requires some kind of simultaneous translation. If people know about the Babel fish in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's that kind of conceptual image I want to find somehow. And for me, the capability approach seems to provide this. I think for philosophers, it's got enough meat on the bone. It's concerned with freedom. It's concerned, meat, that's a terrible image, sorry. It's got enough to think about. It's concerned with freedom. It's concerned with ends, means, distinctions. It's concerned with equality of what. There's some very, very substantial philosophical questions that the capability approach raises. But it's also, because it's attentive to social and institutional relationships, what's called the conversion factors in the capability approach analytic frame. And it's also concerned with participatory processes of review and reflection. It's very attentive to the kinds of complexity of social relationships and social embeddedness that are of so much interest to writers in sociology and social policy and education and international development. It's also had traction with a range of organizations, UN organizations and NGOs involved in participatory processes on the ground. And it resonates with social policy and practice. And I think this is in response to a question or questions Lorella and Judith raised for me. Why is it able to be so flexible between all these different sites? I think one of the reasons is that the arc of the argument sounds like what you do as a policymaker. If you compare the kind of shape of the argument in Rawls' ideal theory, in Rawls' theory of justice, you need a lot of philosophy to be able to make use or make sense of what look kind of like two simple propositions and how you order the lexical order and those sorts of things. And that's not the way policymakers think. But the way the arc of the argument runs in relation to the capability approach, that it says, what are your resources? Then what is the capability set? What are the opportunities or freedoms people have? And what is in constraining or expanding that capability set to enable them to realize their opportunities? And then we must evaluate the opportunities for education of poor children differently, and or we must, as well as evaluating the functionings, whether they can actually read or write, because that arc from resources to opportunities to outcomes is what policymakers do. I think it talks a language that is resonant, and I think it can operate flexibly as a kind of glue. However, the capability approach isn't going to answer everything, and I think there are lots of areas for further work on it. I'm not sure how much, because it's been such a kind of outcome of a kind of settled world, the kind of social policy agreements that were made after the Cold War. I'm not sure how much it can talk to the terrible violence, the terrible disruption, the kind of scale of the crises that have faced us over the current year of COVID, and I think lie ahead in relation to climate crisis. So I think there might be something a bit too cozy and settled about the capability approach, and it needs more work. Some of the important areas in which I think it's underdeveloped are, what are the social imaginaries? Where are we going to? What visions are formulated? And the approach is very open and flexible and accommodating of many different visions. But given the scale of the many different harms that confront us, is something more distilled needed. The second problem in relation to the capability approach is about history. It's because of the focus on conversion factors in relation to opportunities or the capability set. I'm not sure it brings in history enough, and the kind of historical conditions of possibility, if you want, for education to address the multiplicity of dimensions of poverty. I'm not sure if it's got enough traction on that. And lastly, the work on agency and the capability approach is not, in my view, specific enough around the problems of children's agency and the problems about adults' agency in relation to children under conditions of poverty. So that the issue of agency, which is often just part of talking about capabilities, I think needs much more refinement to consider violence, injustice, exclusion, and the fragilities of the present. And so that's what the last ellipsis is about. I don't know where else it can go. It seems a good enough conceptual frame for now, but it needs addition. And I guess the questions from you will help expand that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Elaine, for such an engaging and provocative, for some of us, presentation. You've been tremendously on time. That's fantastic. Now, whilst people are formulating their questions, I'm going to start with mine, if you don't mind. I'm very much in favor of everything that you've said with some further specification, but one possible counter argument in relation to adopting the capability approach as a conceptual glue between different understanding of poverty in relation to children, in relation to education, different normative frameworks, different theoretical approaches, is that the approach is in itself quite complex. Despite its apparent simplicity, it is quite a complex construct, quite a complex theoretical ethical framework. And sort of analysis of poverty have already got a very clear vocabulary. They are sort of determined very much in relation to income, or poverty seen as a lack of income rather than as a capability deprivation or a deprivation in the opportunities to lead a good life. And I was wondering whether you have any thought about this apparent kind of different consideration that, you know, you're presenting the approach as a very, and I agree with that, as a very fruitful way forward, both theoretically and practically. But at the same time, others think that in fact is hindering a consideration of poverty in relation to children or generally, exactly because it substitutes a new framework with, you know, over existing understandings. I wonder whether you have any thought about that at all.
My thought is that it can be simple enough without going just to the simplicity of income. I mean, income has incredible it's a very condensed notion. But the problem of saying that poverty is only to be associated with income is that you often set the bar you can set the bar too low, so that the global policy comparisons is purchase at $2 a day. $2 a day as a level of poverty. Well, it's risible. It doesn't talk to all the things that are needed to live a good life. When you set a poverty line higher than that, much closer to what is required to live a good life, then a whole lot of toxic discourses arise, blaming the poor for in South Africa, where there is a child support grant given to poor families. Girls are blamed for spending their mother money on braiding their hair rather than feeding their children. So I think that the problem about setting the metric of justice about income is that it's easily quantifiable, but it doesn't avoid or doesn't get to the heart of the issues about shame, shame and blame and guilt. And I think that a number of people have been very successful in simplifying the capability approach down into, you know, very simple policy messages. So UNDP, for example, talks about simple and expanded capabilities. A simple capability is just basic levels of education, basic levels of health, yes, and so on. So I don't think that it's unsuccessful or not useful for a policy audience. I think that it's better than the simple one, and yet it keeps the relevance of income also in play.
Thank you, Elaine. I wonder whether there are questions or comments emerging from the audience, please. Well, we've got a couple of minutes, so I've got another question, Elaine, if you don't mind. And this relates to your last point, not leaving open the space for new possible points that are missing or are critical for the capability approach, but rather how the capability approach is in fact still located within a traditional ideal philosophical position in relation to child's agency. So the notion of agency within the capability approach for children does not seem to agree with what is emerging from data or research in the field. So, for example, when we hear what is the situation of teenage pregnant girls, of course, in Uganda, we see that you know there is a level of agency there, as well as when children are forced or not in labor in childhood. And there's a level of agency which is often not acknowledged in philosophical positions. And I wonder whether you have any comment on that. And I wonder whether Judith also has a question or no. Okay. Elaine, do you have any comment on children's agency within the capability approach?
Yeah, well, I think this is the point that I feel I need to develop a bit more thought in dialogue with some of the writers on children and the capability approach. But my feeling is that the capability approach is rather paternalistic. It doesn't want to accord children's agency. And I think that paternalism or that notion of care for children needs to somehow be relocated in capability approach analysis into conversion factors. So to what extent is there institutional arrangements for good quality education for all children, good free contraception for all children, good protection against violence for all children, so that the problem, so that, and then we recenter or rebuild the notion of children's agency in the approach, because people, writings on the capability approach in children have always been wary about that. They always say, you know, children's capabilities have to be constrained because they're children. I think there's a kind of illusion of analysis being made, and the reason for protecting and caring for children needs to be located in the as an aspect of conversion factors, so that we give enough attention to children's agency.
Thank you. A very, very interesting discussion. Just to note that there might be very good reason for having an acceptable level of paternalism in a position in regard to children, given the status, and also if we want to protect some of those goods of childhood that are theorized by some. But this is, you know, further conversations and further discussions. And we have now reached our time. I would like to thank you very, very much for such an interesting and challenging opening to our seminars today, and for engaging with mainly my questions so nicely and in a very constructive way. And I would like now to introduce, if there are no further points from the audience, I would like to introduce our second speaker today. So thank you very much again, Elaine. And our second speaker today is my, again, a co-organizer of this seminar series, and is Professor Judith Swissa. Now, Judith is Professor of Philosophy of Education at UCL Institute of Education. Her work explores the intersections between political ideas and educational practice, particularly concerning the assumption of state schooling, characteristic of much educational philosophy, theory, and research, and the underlying political and moral assumptions of pedagogical relationships outside institutional forms of education. She has written about parent-child relationships, educational experiments that challenge the state system, political education, and issues of belonging and identity. Her research draws on political and moral philosophy, particularly anarchist theory, theories of social justice, and utopian theories. Her publications include Anarchism and Education, a Philosophical Perspective, and with Stefan Remarquez, The Claims of Parenting. Today, Judith is presenting on Seeing and Not Seeing Poverty, Schools as Site of Radical Prefiguration. Judith, over to you, please.
Thank you, Lorella. I'm just going to share my screen. Right. Whoops. How can I do this? What? Why is it not on slideshow? Okay, there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is explore a perspective on thinking about the relationship between education and child poverty that I don't see as in tension with any of the analyses or proposals that have been made throughout these discussions over the last 4 seminars, or in fact anything that Elena's just said, but I think it's a perspective that hasn't been given that much attention in our discussions. And so I'm kind of asking different questions, if you want, and these come from my sort of philosophical and political interest that Lorella mentioned. So what I'm interested in is how narratives about child poverty, whether it's policy narratives or sort of normative narratives by philosophers trying to address issues of poverty, how they often reflect underlying social and political imaginaries. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that. And what I want to think about is sort of starting from a different conceptual starting point, a conceptual starting point which doesn't assume a social imaginary in which poverty is just a sort of inevitable feature of our social lives. And I think if we start from that different starting point, perhaps we can think of education differently, not as part of a strategy to mitigate the worst effects of poverty, but as a site, or one of the sites, in which to challenge the underlying social imaginaries and to offer alternatives and to prefigure alternatives. And I'll say a bit, if I have time, about where I'm taking the idea of prefiguration from. So the idea of the social imaginary has been discussed, I think, by several political philosophers, but I'm drawing particularly on this definition by Charles Taylor, which talks about the way in which people imagine their social existence. And this is not just a sort of abstract theoretical idea, because as Taylor points out, it has a sort of constitutive function, right? The way that we imagine our relationships with each other in social and political spaces creates expectations and affects the ways in which we make normative arguments and the ways in which we think about what's possible and what's desirable in political spaces. So what I want to suggest is that we need to be asking, in addition to the sort of normative questions that my colleagues have been asking throughout all these seminars, I think we also need to be asking normative questions about the educational environment. And by that, I mean all pedagogical spaces, not just schools, but including schools, and how that environment can challenge and offer alternatives to the underlying social imaginary in which poverty is seen as just a sort of inevitable feature of our social and political life. So one of the things that prompted some of my thinking about this when I was preparing this presentation was reading an excerpt from this recently published book by Musa Okwonga. Musa Okwonga is a British poet and author who, at the age of 12, won a scholarship to Eton. And he's recently published a memoir reflecting on his time at Eton. He was there in the 90s. And he talks partly about the racism he experienced as being one of the very few Black pupils at Eton, but he also makes some really interesting comments on his fellow pupils and graduates, and how the experience of being at Eton and their sort of background affects what I would describe as their social imaginary, and how this is also sort of reenacted in the ways in which discourses around politics through these that are sort of articulated by these people goes on to explore. And for those of you who are not in the UK, in case you don't know, Eton is probably one of the most famous so-called British public schools, which is not public at all, but private in that it's independent of the state sector and fee paying. There roughly 7% of children in England go to private schools, and they charge fees that range, right? But Eton is probably amongst the most expensive. So this is just a snapshot from the school website, where you see the current fees, which are £14,000 a term. So that works out to over £40,000 a year to send your child to Eton. And that's just the fees. That's before you even start talking about the extra. So this is clearly completely out of the reach of the average British family. And one of the interesting things that Okwonga reflects on is the connections that he sees between the kinds of pupils that typically go to Eton and the kinds of attitudes towards political issues that are expressed by these people when they go on to graduate and often take up positions of leadership, right? So a disproportionate number of private school graduates end up in very powerful positions, whether in government, in the cabinet, or in other positions of power within society. So Okwonga reflects on this, conservative politicians. It is often conservative politicians who've been to Eton. Boris Johnson was at Eton, for example. And he talks about the attitude that he sees in them, the ruthlessness that they seem to have towards, for example, policies to cut public spending, the way they, as he puts it, swat aside the latest poverty statistics as if they were weak retorts in a sixth form debating chamber. And he comments that many people from his school, as he sees it, have never really seen widespread poverty. Like, they've read about it, they maybe seen it on their gap years, but they don't really believe in it, or rather they think it's something you can elevate yourself out of if you just work a little bit harder. And just to give you an idea of what Okwonga's referring to here, there have been quite a lot of media reports recently about just how many of the current, Boris Johnson's government, for example, went either to Eton or to very similar private schools, amongst a very privileged elite. So this is a headline from nearly 2 years ago, but the pictures that I've put here, these are people who are in the current, these are amongst current Tory leading politicians. So this is just, if you look at a list of current senior members of the cabinet or senior Tory politicians, all of these people here went to independent fee-paying schools, either to Eton or to other fee-paying schools. You might also notice something else that they all have in common, but I will not comment on that here. So I think that Okwonga's getting at something here, but I also think that it's not exactly true when he says that people like Boris Johnson have never seen widespread poverty. And this is where the idea of sort of seeing and not seeing is relevant. And I see that Jack Bickers in the audience here, so I just want to acknowledge that some of these ideas, I think, build on conversations that I've had with Jack, who's explored this idea of seeing and not seeing in his work, and has looked much more in depth at the sort of epistemological underpinnings of this, which I don't have time to go into. But the point I want to make is that it's not really the case that these people don't see poverty. They're not completely oblivious to the existence of poverty in Britain, including child poverty. The question is how they see it, right? They see it as a certain thing. I mean, this is perhaps related to this sort of Wittgensteinian idea of seeing as, right? But I think there's a danger in falling into the temptation of thinking that, you know, if only people were more aware of these facts, then they would be motivated to care and do something about it. But that's not what's going on here, right? They know that there are people living in poverty. And it's not the knowing that is going to cause them to care about it. And more importantly, and this has to do with my point about the social imaginary, I think when such people do witness poverty, they don't see it as a political issue. So here is an example of that. Jacob Rees-Mogg, another Eton graduate and close associate of Boris Johnson, when he was confronted recently with the evidence of the massive increase of families in Britain needing to use food banks, and including in his own constituency, he commented to a journalist that he thought this was rather uplifting. In other words, you know, yes, there are people who need food banks, but isn't it wonderful to see the generosity of spirit of the British people who are willing to give so generously to, you know, donate money and food to food banks so that these people can have enough to eat. So in other words, he sees the poverty, but he sees it as just a fact of our social life that requires not a response of outrage, but a response of sympathy, right, or charity, right, requires an individualized response, not a political response. And you see this also in his comments in response, his sort of fury at the headlines last December that UNICEF announced that they were going to begin some of their operations in the UK, given the vast numbers of hungry children living in the UK. Rees-Mogg declared that this was just, you know, a political stunt staged by UNICEF, and it was outrageous that they were, you know, that in one of the richest countries in the world, our children should not be forced to rely on a charity that usually works in war zones. Okay, so the outrage here is not that there are that many poor children in the world. The outrage is that this is being framed as something akin to the political crisis going on in war zones, right? And so there were interesting debates, I think, around this, you know, whether it's being politicized or not. And I think as a connected point, and this point I think has been made by others in this seminar series, arguably the very talk of child poverty rather than just poverty contributes to this move of depoliticizing the issue, because it's much easier when we're talking about children to invoke sort of moral responses about care and compassion. And I think it is interesting that Rees-Mogg explicitly talks about our children. You know, it's upsetting that why should our children have to rely on this political group, right, instead of, you know, our own charity. So it's a move that on the one hand implies that you know, it sort of demands that we respond to these children in the same way as we would to our own children, you know, on the basis of kind of bond of care and familial obligations. But at the same time, it denies the existence of this as a political problem, right? And underlying this way of seeing poverty, I think, is a particular social imaginary, right? So that's really what I want to get at. So I think it's interesting to think how children in particular get positioned here, and how it's easier to mobilize support for child poverty than it would be if we just talked about poverty. And I think that's part of the reason why the issue is easy to sort of depoliticize in that way. So I'm not denying that there is partly perhaps a kind of moral failure on the part of people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, in that, you know, although you might argue that he has some kind of sympathy for poor people, he certainly doesn't have empathy. He certainly is incapable of imagining himself in these people's shoes. And as Okwonga points out in his comments on Eton graduates, no doubt this is largely to do with the incredibly entitled and privileged environment that such people have grown up in. Right? They cannot see their own privilege for what it is, and they cannot really grasp the level of material hardship that structures people's lives in such a way that it's impossible for them to, as Mog would say, work their way out of poverty. Right? But I think there's something else going on here. There's an underlying social imaginary. In some cases, this is implicit. I think in the case of many politicians, it's an explicit commitment to a particular ideology. It's an ideology which regards social inequality as not just sort of an unfortunate feature of many societies, but as inevitable and as in fact productive, right? And which sees poverty as not really something that matters in and of itself. Right? It's a feature of society that is best addressed by acts of charity, but it's not a sort of focal point for reorganizing our entire political structure. And this is often described as a neoliberal ideology, and certainly I think you could accurately describe many of our leading politicians as neoliberals, but I think it is important to distinguish between the actual sort of philosophical position of neoliberalism and the sort of rather vague notions of neoliberalism, which often get kind of floated around and which I'm not sure are entirely subscribed to by all the people that are charged with being neoliberal. Right? So in the original neoliberal theories articulated by people like Hayek, in fact, the idea of the minimal state is really central, and the state's role is not only to regulate the market, which is seen as the best way to enable individual competition and productivity, but is also charged with providing a basic safety net so that nobody falls below an absolute minimum threshold. And Thatcher, for example, who claimed that Hayek was her favorite philosopher, often talked about this idea of the basic safety net, right? So I think that in the sort of focus on neoliberalism as the root of all evil, which is often the sense you get from critics on the left, I think there's a danger that we put too much emphasis on this very particular set of policy ideals and ways of organizing the economy and political structures, which, as Campbell puts it, is a reorganization of capitalism, right? And it's the social imaginary underlying capitalism that I want to look at, not neoliberalism per se, although of course neoliberalism is a sort of subset of capitalist positions. But underlying capitalism as a set of ideas, as a political system, is a particular social imaginary. And this imaginary is not radically different, whether we're talking about a kind of benign form of capitalism where there's a sort of Keynesian state-managed welfare state, or a more overtly neoliberal capitalist state with privatized, formerly public services. Right? So underlying, I think, all versions of capitalism is a particular social imaginary, an imaginary that's as I say, is based on competition, on the kind of notion of human nature as being driven by, this sort of homo economicus, that people as essentially selfish egoists competing with each other, and of inequalities as being inevitable and in fact useful features of society. All right. So critics of the sort of political agendas of people like Boris Johnson and other Tory politicians often focus on their failure to live up to the promise of providing the basic safety net, right? So there's a lot of criticism of the collapse of the welfare state, the failure to provide this, to prevent people from falling below this basic threshold. They often also focus on exploding some of the myths that are central to this ideological agenda. And one of these main myths, of course, is the myth of meritocracy. The myth of meritocracy, I think, is central to the social imaginary that is underlying capitalism as a system, but also particularly neoliberalism, right? But it's crucial, I think, to understanding how it is that people see poverty, because it's the myth of meritocracy, I think, that sustains and is sustained by this social imaginary in which poverty and inequality are not political problems per se. And so a lot of people have criticized and sort of tried to explode this myth. And one of the key areas in which this work, I think, is important is when it comes to the role of children. Children, of course, play a key role in sustaining the myth of meritocracy. They're the kind of heroes of the stories that provide the sort of that persuade people of the truth of the myth, right? So we're always hearing these stories of successful, children who grew up in terrible environments but went on to become incredibly successful. This is how the myth of meritocracy is sustained by these individualized stories. But as Stefan Collini recently pointed out in a review of a book on meritocracy, of course, the fact that these stories are individual stories that kind of stand out is an indication in many ways that this is not the way the system is working, right? That for most people, it's not the case that you can miraculously work your way out of a poor background and succeed on, in the terms of the system. I think it's important to note also that meritocracy is not just an ideal of the right. The myth of meritocracy is invoked also by people, on the center or even left of center. So here's
5 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry.
I hope I'll finish. Here's Obama explicitly invoking a meritocratic ideal in his second inaugural address, right, and linking it, of course, to the American dream and to the progressive social policies that he was trying to promote. But again, I think behind all these narratives is an imaginary in which our starting point is a picture of a world in which poverty and a degree of inequality is inevitable. And if that's your starting point, then education just becomes one of the mechanisms by which you can manage the causal relationship between people's socioeconomic background and their educational achievements, right? Then it's just a question of engineering the system. It's not a question of rethinking the system. And so, as I said, many of the critics of the myth of meritocracy have focused on challenging the alleged link that it suggests between educational success and socioeconomic advancement, right? So one way in which you see this really clearly is in the so-called Frank Field report. This was a major government report into child poverty over 10 years ago now, entitled Preventing Poor Children Becoming Poor Adults. And Frank Field, who was the author of the report, who again is not associated with the far right politically by any means, right? He's a Labour politician, but he explicitly invokes a meritocratic ideal, right? His policy that he's proposing in this report is intended to intervene in the system through, for example, massive investment in early years education, in parenting classes, so as he puts it, to change the position in which children from poor backgrounds will be able to gain on merit in the income hierarchy, right? So it's an explicitly meritocratic ideal. And it's been criticized, rightly, I think, for invoking these meritocratic ideals. So critics have challenged it on both empirical and sort of philosophical grounds, pointing out that these empirical claims are actually, not based on any rigorous research, that, as we know, decades of social, data has shown that it's still the case that children's socioeconomic background, the families that they're born into, are a better predictor of their socioeconomic success than educational achievement. And importantly, that in spite of what the report says, if you want to eradicate child poverty, actually simply increasing the incomes and the material resources that poor families are able to access is one of the safest ways to do that, right? Rather than making rather dodgy claims about how poverty isn't just about material resources. The report makes all sorts of arguments about how poverty is transmitted through, a kind of cultural patterns, expectations, and as critics have pointed out, this is a sort of worrying political attempt to revive cultural deficit theories that were kind of out of favor many years ago, and ideas of the culture of poverty, associated, of course, with even darker theories of eugenics, for example. So I'm not disagreeing with any of these criticisms of the kind of meritocratic ideal or these policy agendas that assume that kind of narrative, nor with the work of philosophers of education and political philosophers who I think make similar criticisms about the links between education and labour market prospects, right? So as philosophers like Brighouse and Harry Brighouse and Adam Swift point out, education is a positional good, right? And it is so because of this causal link between education and the socioeconomic positions in a system in which one's position in the labour market is largely determined by educational qualifications. And Brighouse acknowledges that in theory it might be possible to break that causal link, but he doesn't think it's politically feasible. And so in the absence of any sort of radical policy that would break that link through, for example, massive redistribution of wealth, what most political theorists on the left writing about education end up doing is defending a state education system in which the government should try as far as possible to mitigate the worst effects of poverty on children's life chances. Now, I'm not disagreeing with any of those suggestions or with the criticisms of the collapse of the welfare state, as you see here in this recent paper by journal article by Polly Toynbee, right? So I don't think that any of this is wrong, but I think there should be something more that schools can be doing other than just acting as part of a mechanism within a system in which all that we can do is try and mitigate the worst effects of the system in which we find ourselves. And I think schools can be partly ways in which to challenge this underlying social imaginary. So the analysis of what's wrong with this social imaginary and the possibility of alternatives, I'm drawing from Marxist and anarchist theorists who've analysed in great detail the historical and conceptual connections between capitalism, the modern nation state, and poverty. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this or try and convince you of the sort of rightness of any of these arguments. I think this is just a kind of snapshot of some of the claims that have been made that show the clear connection between the accumulation of wealth as a central feature in the development of capitalism and poverty, and what Kropotkin and other Republican anarchist theorists called wage slavery, right? So these are all just sort of, this is just a glimpse of the kind of analysis that I think needs to take place in order to expose this social imaginary for what it is. But I don't think you have to be a Marxist or an anarchist in order to recognize the point that the underlying imaginary is what allows us to live in the system that we live in a way that sees it as sort of inevitable and beyond criticism, rather than seeing it as a political choice. And I think schools can be one of the places that we should be able to explore these underlying ideas, understand how certain choices have come to be made, and posit possible alternatives. And this is what I mean by schools as sites of radical prefiguration. So schools and other places can prefigure alternative forms of social relationships through enacting different social imaginaries, different ways of configuring the way we operate together as a polity. And I think they can do this in two ways. So one way they can do this is through...
And to stop.
Okay. So I'll just whiz through these last slides then.
Right.
So political education, I think, is one way this can be done, not given the current climate. And school ethos, again, I think there's lots of work on this, on competition. And I'll end it there. Thank you, Lorella, and sorry for going over.
That's okay, thank you. Thank you, Judith. This is an extremely rich and very interesting talk yet again. I'm sure it will provoke and sort of raise many questions. I don't see any at the moment on the chat, so I just wanted to quickly, I mean, I obviously saw some very lovely quotes from pronunciation. No, I have two questions. The first is very broad and general, and it seems to me that your position, how ideal is your position in relation to, you know, the schools as sites of prefiguration? And my second point relates to the role of the state. Now, I can see that I see that you seem to configure the role of the state as mainly reproducing what are the underlying assumptions of capitalism, and you seem to invoke a different invoke a different role of the state. Do you think that the state can in fact act in a much more decisive way, certainly not coming from current politicians, but suppose there is a kind of political class that is more representative of you know, the various components of a society, and can the state have a different role in this capitalist economy and associated meritocratic ideals, which, by the way, I understand are now hugely criticized also by Brickhouse and Swift after a first more kind of. So two questions, role of the state and how ideal is your trying to move away from ideals theory philosophically, please.
So yes, regarding the role of the state, yes, of course the state can play a more positive role. And if I had to choose, I'd rather live in a strong, you know, socialist state with a strong welfare system than a kind of rampant capitalist system. I don't think that excludes the possibility of imagining different ways of organizing society that are not state. But yeah, I think the state definitely can play and should be playing more of a role in terms of in terms of the sort of welfare systems that are currently under attack. But in the ideal question, I mean, I don't see my position as ideal. I see it as political, in the sense that I think any view of educational content is political. I think the notion of ideal, because I'm quite influenced by social anarchist theory, I think perhaps I think of the ideal in a different way. So an ideal is not a blueprint. An ideal is not a kind of model of an ideal society that you imagine can ever be achieved, because that would imply a kind of human perfectibility, which I don't think is realistic. So if you mean ideal in the sense of a kind of motivating image of how we can make society more just, more equal, more democratic, yes, but it's not an ideal in the sense of a model of an ideal thing. So I don't know if that really answers the question.
But partially, but I'll accept it because I don't want to monopolize the discussion as I seem to be. Okay, I've got Carl with a question, and then I've got a question from Ursula. So Carl, please unmute yourself. You're already unmuted, and go with your question, and then I will pose the one by Ursula if she doesn't want to query it yourself. Carl, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. That was absolutely fascinating and taps into much of what I'm trying to write about and do in my work at the moment. And it taps into a couple of things for me. I think there's a whole conversation that hasn't been revealed here about what we haven't said the word working classes. That hasn't been mentioned since we started this conference. And I think there's something in that. And I think there's something in this for me around assets of class and where the working class are in and what we understand and mean by the working classes. And I think if you look, for example, at the Hartlepool by-election we've just had, it raises some really fascinating questions around what is working class and what is poverty, and presents many, many complex notions of those ideas that if you bring them into Judith's thinking, and I share much of Judith's thinking, also then raise questions for us regarding our positionality and our assets, and how we can have these conversations. In terms of the politicization of schooling, and the doing and thinking of teachers, I've been doing this work for a number of years now, and what I found absolutely fascinating is how often I hear from schools and teachers a social imaginary that is unable to grasp beyond the present system. And it seems to me that is almost a defeat within education. And I ask myself, how has that occurred? Because schools should surely be sites for the land of the imagined, as Keats would say. How do we develop the land of the imagined? And again, and there's another side of this, and I could speak about this for hours, so I won't, but there's another side of this, which is about the discourses in schooling and schools. So, for example, I went to a school recently where they had a huge banner outside which said, "We guarantee a successful future for all our students." And I was horrified by that banner because it's absolute nonsense, on so many different levels. But it's tying into this idea of meritocracy, which is what Judith's unpicking. And I think my presentation maybe hopefully will respond to some of this. There's just one thing I want to do, and it wasn't really a question, it was more an engagement. There's a great book, I don't know if people are aware of it, by a Balkan author called Kapka Kasabova. It's called To the Lake. And there's a sentence in it on poverty. And I started using it in my work with teachers because I think it's such a powerful statement. It'll just take me 1 second to read it out to you, if I may, because I think it'll give us all something to think about. It says, "In poverty, you never learn to stand on your own feet. You're always learning to lean on loved ones like a crutch. Poverty digs you deeper into dependency. In such a culture, there's nothing to challenge the supremacy of close relationships and clan loyalty." And I think that's a really interesting approach to understanding the lived experiences of poverty, that I think for the Eton elites and for many, many people, they're seeing and not seeing, how can we begin to get those understandings of thick descriptions of poverty? And this ties into classism, capitalism, all these different things. As I say, I could go on for a lot longer, but I won't.
You want me to respond? I mean, I don't disagree with anything that you've said, Carl, but
No,
I think these things are all really connected, because I think the shifts in the labour market and the shifts in the traditional class system, largely as a result of globalization, means that it's a lot harder, I think, for schools to do anything other than concentrate on basic qualifications, right? So, in 30, 40 years ago, if you left school at 16 with very few qualifications, you still had a good chance of getting a decent traditional working class job and being, financially secure. Now those jobs are gone for most people, right? So that traditional class divide, which was reflected in the education system, that isn't really there anymore. And so it's now, I think, even harder for schools to pretend to be doing something else. Although, as you say, that there's this sort of, meritocratic lies it's clearly a lie, right? It's clearly a lie, and I think kids know that, which is partly why they're so disaffected by much of what they're taught in school.
I am concerned with time. I would like people to have a short break, but I don't want to curtail the discussion. So I would like to give voice to Ursula's question, which is the following: how can we challenge privileged thinking and the social imaginary in private schools?
Well, I mean, if you really want to challenge the sort of political structures that we have that allow this social imaginary to be sustained, then I think you have to abolish private schools. I mean, you know, no mainstream politician is ever going to propose that, because it would be political suicide. But that is the logical conclusion for me. I mean, and if you look at countries where there aren't private schools, or there are very, very few private schools, those are much more egalitarian societies. So places, you know, like Finland, for example, or so that the answer would be just get rid of them. But that's a bit of a cop-out to say now. Obviously, there are other things that and in terms of actual pedagogical, you know, more creative pedagogical innovation and practices, it is often in the independent sector that you see more of that going on, right? I mean, some of the most democratic schools in terms of their ethos and governance are in the independent sector, not in the state sector. So, you know, I don't want to just lump all private schools. I don't think private schools are one thing, and I don't think they're the root of all evil here. But we need to think about all these issues, obviously.
I would also like just to give a voice to two comments that are in the chat. One by Gary. Even if we see poverty, that is the existence of material inequality, do we see in inverted commas deprivation, that is the process of creating poverty, the act of depriving? That's Gary's question. And further on, there's a comment by Patricia White, saying it was so good to hear a challenge to equality of opportunity as an educational aim. How can the ideal of winners and losers in education persist even amongst progressive thinkers? I leave you for a 1 minute comment on these questions, if you don't mind, Judith, and then we'll regroup after a short break, please.
So I think there are people working in education who are trying alternative forms of organizing schools. I mean, I think if you look at the cooperative movement, you know, cooperative schools, democratic alternatives, including some within the state sector. I mean, they're pockets of practice, but I think it is possible to do different things even within the state sector. And this is the sort of work that, you know, my colleague Michael Fielding has been exploring for years through his work. There's a new democratic school just open in South London that is not fee paying, very interestingly serving children of all the local community, and kind of, you know, refusing to have anything to do with this sort of meritocratic ideal. So I think it's possible, but I think we should be supporting those experiments.
Okay. I have another comment, Judith. May I ask you please to look at the chat, because I'm concerned with time. There's a comment by Ursula that follows on from your reply to her. Is 3:25, 25 minutes past 3, and we have time for about a 10-minute break, no longer than that. Can I please thank Judith for such an engaging and interesting presentation, and thank again Elaine for introducing and opening the sessions. And can I ask everybody to be back at 25 to 4, please, and we reconvene then. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks.
I think we can start the second part of our seminar. I see people returning. Excellent. Okay. So I'm delighted to introduce Carl Emery as our next speaker. Carl is Research Fellow at the University of Manchester, specializing in poverty and disadvantage and social and emotional well-being. He has, for the past 15 years, worked on a range of schemes in this field, with particular emphasis on disengaged young people. His experiences include contributing to the social and emotional aspects of learning, SEAL program for the DFES, acting as a writer and consultant for the QCA on both the personal development curriculum and the personal learning and thinking skills frameworks, as well as being an advisor to the Welsh Assembly Government on the development of a national framework for young people's social and emotional well-being. Carl is the author of a number of teaching resources and publications in this field, including Children's Social and Emotional Well-being for the Policy Press 2012. Today, Carl is talking on Local Matters, a university school collaboration in Northwest England, reshaping how education, poverty, and place are understood and interact. Welcome, Carl, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I need to change my biography because all those policy-making roles are pretty much the complete opposite of where I am positionally these days. So yeah, I critique them a lot. So if you could give me the shared screen and I'll go into my PowerPoint.
You should have the share screen. Yeah,
I've got it. Yeah. Okay, so as I say, I'm Dr. Carl Emery, the Research Fellow for Disadvantage and Poverty at the University of Manchester, and I run a research programme called Local Matters. And today I'm going to talk about local matters, and I'm going to place it into some of the policy and sort of discursive positioning that we've talked about today. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we actually do. So I don't really want to spend too long on this. It's just to paint a picture for you because you'll all know this. Current national data on poverty. Generally, if it's an income of less than 17,640, you're considered to be living in relative poverty. Just some things to take away from there. 51% of all children in poverty are in families with the youngest child age under 5. Poverty rates are highest for people in households where the head of the household is from a Pakistani or Bangladeshi ethnic group. And the proportion of children in poverty living in households where at least one person was in work was 75%. I think that's a really critical statistic, and it taps into things that have been talked of today, particularly regarding sort of work and ideas of meritocracy. So these are the harsh realities of child poverty in the UK in regard to education. In a classroom of 30, there's generally 9 children living in poverty. Now, of course, that's just the average. And what I'm interested in is the contextualization of this. So for me and much of the areas I work in, that 9 children actually is more often 18, 20, sometimes 24, 25. So what does that look like in the Northwest? What does child poverty look like in the Northwest of England? So these are the places that Local Matters is working in the moment, in these school districts. So in Blackburn, we have a child poverty rate of 43%. Manchester has a child poverty rate of 45%, and there's a district of Manchester, Gorton, which actually has a child poverty rate of 48%. We believe that's now around 52%. So actually one could say the majority of children live in poverty in Gorton. Birkenhead near Liverpool, 34%. And then Stockport, which is another local authority district we're working in, is 27%. The reason I've put Stockport down there is because the northern ward of Stockport adjoins the southern ward of Gorton. So you're essentially within a mile going from a 48% of child poverty rate to a 27% child poverty rate. And I think that alone indicates the necessity to talk about context. So we're in a time where poverty in schooling is understood through closing the disadvantage gap. Disadvantage is considered to be an individual or household problem. And I talk a lot about the metrics of poverty and very much about how poverty is understood through free school meals, as you'll all understand, and the pupil premium grant. So there is a metric to poverty. Poverty and the solutions are metric understood and driven, and solutions lie in fixing things for individuals. Again, talking back to the meritocracy discourse. And we have a society that believes schools can fix this disadvantage gap. Disadvantage gap being the gap between what young people who are living in poverty achieve regarding academic qualifications and those not in poverty achieve regarding academic qualifications and cognitive abilities. That in itself is a very contested and narrow understanding of what the disadvantage gap is. Society and policymakers believe that schools need to know what works, and then they're offered short-term interventions. Schools are then encouraged to buy these interventions from providers. EEF, as everyone probably knows, being the big broker in much of this. That's the Education Endowment Foundation. And the whole notion of what works is, of course, universal. It's not contextualized, very much in the same way that we have notions of the universal good teacher. So our thinking is that in England, child poverty and its impact on education has been responded to through a focus, and far too narrow focus, on the achievement gap. And there's been a whole host of initiatives to try and close this achievement gap over 20 years, at least, if not more. So we're talking at the moment around things, as I said, regarding the pupil premium grant, and we're talking about support for families to help them engage with education, Sure Start. Then there's been a whole series of initiatives connected to social mobility, things like the social and emotional aspects of learning, which I was involved in, and things like the London Challenge. And the driver of these policy initiatives, I certainly believe, is a subjectivation of school communities to a discourse of the achievement agenda. And this achievement agenda has associated performative measures against it. And I believe this implicit assumptions associated with this are notions of constrained educational agency, which are attached to a pathologized view about young people and their families living in poverty. So I'm talking here about the pathologization of poverty. And I'm talking here about how young people living in poverty are often universally seen and understood. From this deficit and pathologized perspective, the school and the child are essentially picked up and removed from the historical and everyday forces of the place they're based, the community they serve, and the region they're in. I think this bleaches out structural, social, and economic forces, employment, housing, transport, health, but perhaps even more critically, it makes invisible history, culture, geography, and psychology of place. And it also takes no account of individual characteristics such as gender, race, and class, or the emotional costs. So this model that we work with regarding poverty and schooling places all the responsibility on teachers, children, and parents. And one outcome of this conversation is a practice, as I've said earlier, is dominated by pupil premium and ideas like the EEF. So this is atomized, measurable understanding of poverty. How we understand and respond to child poverty in education, I don't believe is working. This metric-driven one-size-fits-all, off-the-shelf interventions, deprofessionalised teachers, and they position parents as a problem. They miss out lots of pupils who are living in poverty and make the place they live invisible. So what we're trying to do with Local Matters is challenge teaching and learning policy notions that one size fits all. We are trying to build local solutions to local problems. We believe being a school or a teacher in a high poverty area is a different job that brings different demands. So Local Matters started about 3 years ago, And last year it was awarded the University of Manchester Commendation for High Impact. So what is it? So Local Matters is a research approach where we work with networks and groups of teachers in high poverty schools. We do this over a 12-month period, and we work with them through a series of collaborative research experiences whereby we sit beside them and critically examine current poverty policy and knowledge. So how do we understand poverty? How is it measured? And where have these measurements and understanding come from? We particularly look at the story of the culture of poverty and the work of pain, which many of you will know came from some very questionable research in America and has come to dominate the current policy agenda. We look and we explore alternatives to these one-dimensional universal programs, and we explore those alternatives and we build research skills with these teachers. They then take those research skills into their school community with our supervision and support. And through action research projects, they gather deep local knowledge of poverty. They build deeper relationships and bring that knowledge back into the school to shape its policies and practices. So this talks to something that Judith was highlighting really. It operates from a different equity discourse and agenda. It is politicised to a degree. I approach this as a critical realist. I approach this through critical discourse analysis, and there is a positionality here. We build from collaborative work of grassroots teachers and schools that are allied to activist-orientated university researchers. We are activist researchers, and we believe this approach valorises a set of pedagogical skills and understandings of poverty and place that currently sit outside the achievement gap policy and practice. How do we do it? As I say, we work with teachers and leaders, 70-hour programme over 12 months, through talk sessions, critical seminars and place-based activities. This takes place both in the university, in the community and in the school. We establish a network of researchers. We bring a wide range of poverty research to them. We interrogate this and we train them as social justice poverty researchers. We support them to do their action research and we use the findings to change their school policy and practice. So let's look at that. These are the areas we cover: pedagogy, curriculum, community perceptions and student voice. And here's some examples. One of the things we did with the schools we're working with, we asked them what they believed their schools' attitudes towards poverty were. Because we're very clear that if you don't understand how people see and view and understand poverty, how can you begin to make change? So what we did there is we took the research that's been done on poverty, on measurements of attitudes towards poverty. Now that really had only ever taken place in America. So what we did is we took those American surveys and as a group of colleagues and practitioners, we unpicked them, critically assessed them, and then rewrote them for our own locality. And those schools then ran those poverty attitude surveys across their school communities. We did that with around 600 teachers in the Stockport district. What emerged from those questionnaires was absolutely fascinating, because what emerged was, first of all, that many people working in schools hold deficit notions of poverty and families in poverty. So, for example, questions included in the survey were, should parents work harder to ensure their children aren't living in poverty? Poverty is the fault of individuals. We asked questions around how poverty could be addressed through raising taxes. We asked questions regarding whether society should take responsibility for poverty. And they painted a very clear picture around different approaches to understanding poverty. One of the things we asked questions around was benefits, and what came back to us very clearly was that schools and teachers don't understand the benefit system. So one of the examples of this was, in response to that, we've now got workshops on benefits running in schools for both parents, teachers and the local community. Another example of the research we've done is we work with Year 5 children in a very highly disadvantaged area, whereby we trained them as community detectives and we asked them to remap their school population, identifying the changes that have gone on in the last 5 years. Through that, the children were able to identify significant changes in terms of who the population is and what the population do. We then brought those stories back into the school community and began to talk about how we could reshape the curriculum to reflect and recognise these stories. Another example we did is we worked with a group of parents in Liverpool, whereby we got them to come into the schools and give thick qualitative responses through focus groups about the reality of their working days. Because too often we heard from teachers stories of parents' work that we knew didn't match the realities. They were myths of parents working. There were myths of generations of unemployment. There were myths of what parents did to work. So what we did is we gathered a very, very thick critical understanding from the parents themselves. This is what my work day looks like. And we then shared that with the teachers. And then we got the teachers to share what their work day looks like with the parents. And through that process, what we began to do was create a new space for parents and teachers to share lived realities. What came out of that was really interesting, because what we heard from both the parents and the teachers as that project progressed was that beforehand they'd only ever met to discuss attendance, attainment and behaviour. So really interesting how the metrics of the system, one could say the metrics perhaps of meritocracy, have closed down spaces that actually need to be reopened to create understanding and reduce and eradicate the myths. These are some of our outcomes. We developed extra support and training for parents to become school governors. We've developed new rules on payment for pre and after school clubs, where we've introduced much longer run-ins and reduced contributions. We changed World Book Day in the project schools from buying a fancy dress costume to children bringing in old clothes and then working with local parents to build their own fancy dress costumes. We built the Parents' Voice project around local history and their work. And we developed a Tell Me project where we interviewed parents and pupils to create a DVD story of the school community that went to all new staff starters. And I think this quote here from one of the regional leaders in Chester captures really well what we've been trying to do with this project. This project is raising professional esteem at all levels. Teachers are regaining their professional pride, and the action research projects are informed by their experience and knowledge. They're regaining a sense of self-determination after being told what to think for too long. And perhaps even more importantly, schools are rediscovering the importance of the local, which they can influence as opposed to the national, where they feel powerless. The classroom has become a new focus of social interaction and pedagogy. So that's what we've been doing with Local Matters. I hope that's painted a picture for you. There's my details if you'd like to know more or get involved, and I'm very happy to answer any questions on that.
Thank you very much, Carl. That was fascinating. And may I say, it might, even though you don't want to link it, but it might very well link with your previous experience and focus on influencing policy, although maybe the local is the new element together with many others. Now, what I wanted to ask you, whilst the audience is getting together their ideas or questions, is what the role of the teachers here and how they came to develop their own action research projects, because that's obviously a very important element of your rethinking the role of the teacher in the local situation, and also, the role of research in addressing poverty. So can you spend a little bit more telling us about how the teachers come to do their action research? Is this supported and funded by the schools? Is it supported by the university? And also, how important is that, please? Or what does it consist of, please?
Yeah, so the Action research comes from a whole series of critical seminars whereby we introduce them and bring them into notions of critical theory in education. So we introduce them to the work of people like Mike Apple, for example. We talk a lot about the notion of critical secretaries. And we really interrogate the story of education and poverty over the last decade. You know, we interrogate it very openly and very, very critically. And it has created some absolutely fascinating, at times, some very, very difficult conversations. Through that process, we begin to bring it towards those areas that I highlighted around pedagogy, curriculum and community. So those are the three areas we focus on. The schools actually pay to take part in this programme, and we work hand in hand with their district leaders. So one of the key elements of this programme has been that local authorities and district leaders have worked alongside me in shaping the programme. So that's been absolutely critical to make it work. I think if it was just individual schools, it wouldn't have worked in the same way. So what we do, myself and the local authority leader, through focus group activities, talk to the schools around which of those three areas they wish to explore. And they will pick pedagogy, community or curriculum. We then operate in a kind of remote supervisor's role in helping them they essentially write a research proposal. Right. So they write as a master's student would, and they work in the same way as a master's student would with me. They develop a research proposal that I work with them on regarding how their action research will take place in their school community. They can then draw on the resources. This is where it reflects back, because in doing that, they then draw on the resources of the university. So they can then draw on our resources of video, transcription, all those different kinds of things. So we bring those resources into the school for them. They undertake their action research projects and we supervise them through that process.
Wonderful, thank you, Carl. There's a question from Sally. Sally, would you like to ask your question directly, please?
Thank you. Carl, that was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it because I'm working on similar stuff myself. And we've got a project where we have been investigating attitudes of teachers across 32 schools across England.
We should share. Yeah, we should share some of our learning, shouldn't we?
We found some wonderful things. We've discovered there's a lot of teachers who just think that pupil premium is discriminatory. Mm-hmm. A lot of teachers that think it's hopeless, that schools shouldn't be the vehicle by which we try and fix these problems. And lots of teachers that think the things that they're doing in the schools just don't work. They're asked to do all sorts of strange things, like mark pupil premium books first and sit them in a particular place in their class. I mean, we've gone mad on this data-driven approach that you're discussing. We're doing this work for the Social Mobility Commission, and they are very much locked into this idea that we need to change these numbers. But they're considering at the moment some more radical ideas about how we go about measuring things. And it's very difficult. I mean, and partly it's very difficult is that we know there are a lot of school leaders who actually really rely on things like Progress 8 data in their school improvement plans. The school communities today across England are really connected to these accountability kind of mindsets. So it's even hard to pull teachers away from this data. So on the one hand, you've said we shouldn't be measuring poverty in this way, but what do we do about the fact that we do? Should we stop league tables? What do you think? Where should we go with the data?
I think I can't give you a simple answer to that. I could give you a very, very long answer we could explore for hours. I think it draws on some of what Judith was saying. I think it draws on notions of what Elaine was saying. I think it's a very, very long, critical conversation because it's about the social imaginary. It's about what we want our societies to look like. You know, poverty is, I don't know how, but we have reached a position where poverty is often one-dimensional in this country. So if you're in poverty, this is how you behave, this is how you act. But conversely also, if you're in poverty, this is what you need and want. And I'm taking this back to the politics of Hartlepool. People, there's this discourse that Hartlepool is one of the most disadvantaged communities in the UK. It is. But that doesn't mean that everyone in Hartlepool thinks, acts, or believes in the same way. And this is what our programme really is about. It's about thick, fluid notions of what local is. That local is fluid, that local isn't fixed. Too often we're tied to these old traditional discourses and narratives of community as well. And I think that's very complicated because communities are ever changing. In terms of how we understand poverty, I think that gets very, very complicated because I've worked with lots and lots of families and children in some of the most deprived areas of the North who, if you personally ask them, they don't believe they live in poverty. So what do you do about that? That raises some really, really fascinating questions. I was recently working with refugee communities in North Manchester. They did not believe they lived in poverty. They were adamant they didn't live in poverty. Now, as a researcher and academic, who am I to tell them that they do live in poverty? And where does that position me? I believe I am a critical secretary. I promote and pursue that notion of Apple's critical secretary. But it places me sometimes in some really interesting, difficult positions because that school registers those children as living in poverty, but the children themselves and the family themselves don't believe they live in poverty. So, simple answers to these things don't exist. But what we need, and I really liked what was said earlier regarding some of the issues Elaine was raising, because it's that issue of process. When we're talking about horizontal, vertical, it's that process and that place for critical conversations and what the processes look like that I believe has been narrowed to a point of where it isn't a conversation anymore. And that's the point that we have to start pushing back.
Elaine, you wanted to intervene? You're muted.
I don't know if it should come now or at the end, because there might be other questions to Carl, but I do have some observations about how you might measure, built on our work on gender, which I could offer at the end, Lorella.
Okay, I just wanted to ask whether Sally wanted to have a rejoinder with Carl.
That was great. Thank you, Carl. No, I'll stop there.
There's just one thing I could add. One of the things I've always been interested in is the Scandinavian, I don't know if people are aware of it, the Crystals model of well-being, which is, I'm sure some of you are. It's something we tried to promote back in the New Labour days when we were looking at whole ideas of what is the point of the curriculum. And that idea of a much more relational driven notion of measurement. And that's certainly where I'm sitting at the moment, with relational notions of measurement and measurement that isn't objective list models. I'm really uncomfortable with objective list models of measurement.
And yet, Carl, an objective way of measuring might address, where appropriately identified, the problem that you were highlighting, the idea that people who live in some poverty do not acknowledge it themselves. So the question for the policymaker as well as for the philosopher is always to navigate this idea. And how can you have a set of principles or a good effective policy which addresses poverty, but at the same time respects the individual rather than discriminating it, him or her. So that is at the core of one of the philosophical issues that we have tried to address. I won't delong myself on this because obviously there is a lot that can intersect with Elaine's talk, Judith's talk, yourself. And if there are no further questions, I would like to thank Carl very, very much again for another fascinating presentation and move on with the idea of rejoining all these themes in the plenary. Is that okay, Carl? Thank you very much. So we now move to our fourth presenter today, and at least geographically, but I'm sure in many other ways, we broaden our horizons and we go to Arathi Sriprakash. I'll introduce Arathi and then she'll present her work. So Arathi is Professor of Education at the University of Bristol. She's a sociologist of education whose work focuses on the politics of social reform in and through education, and on how education, whether an ideal, a practice, or an institution, can govern and contest matters of inequality and difference. Her current research interests are in the racial politics of knowledge, particularly in the field of education and international development. She has conducted ethnographic research on education reform in the Indian and Australian contexts, and on state reforms on childhood and the family. Her publications include Pedagogies for Development, The Politics and Practice of Child-Centered Education in India, and edited with Lucy Hopkins, The Poor Child, The Cultural Politics of Education, Development and Childhood. Today, Arathi is talking to casteism and capitalism in approaches to early childhood education in India. Arathi.
Thank you so much. I will just share my screen with you all. And I'm hoping that you can all see that. Great. So thank you to the conveners, the panelists, and all those who have participated in this fantastic event so far. As Lorella mentioned, I'll be talking today about casteism and capitalism in approaches to early childhood education in India. It draws on research that I conducted with a wonderful team who I'd like to acknowledge now. That's Maithri R, Akash Kumar, Pallavi Sinha, and Ketki Prabha. It's work that was funded by the British Academy, and some of the ideas that I'll just only be able to scratch the surface of in this presentation are more fully developed in a paper that for the references on the slide there. So in this talk, I'm going to be examining how normative discourses about school readiness for poor children circulate in global policy frameworks and school systems, shaping educational strategies of families at local levels. And I want to look specifically at school readiness in practice, drawing out the interlocking dynamics of casteism and capitalism in the experiences of early childhood education in a village that our research project called Gajwa in Bihar in the northwest of India. And what we are arguing through this analysis is that the period of early childhood has itself become a high stakes period, fueled by the perceived need to prepare children for a competitive and unequal schooling system. And those discourses of school readiness are a strong contributing factor to this. So firstly, preschool age children were experiencing forms of instruction that did not meet the norms of developmentally appropriate practice, but which were nevertheless accepted as necessary preparation for the rigid and competitive structures of schooling. Children as young as 3 and 4 years of age were, in our research, observed to be sitting for long periods engaged in rote instruction with little to no opportunity for play-based learning. And corporal punishment, at times severe, was frequently used by instructors in nursery schools as a disciplinary device. Secondly, parents and teachers alike widely interpreted institutional forms of early childhood education as not only desirable and necessary, but also the only legitimate site of learning. The knowledge and pedagogies within families, most of whom who had been excluded from formal education, were deemed irrelevant or deficient to the work of readying children for school. So this sort of entrenched very strong deficit discourses about the capabilities of families, capacities of families themselves to care for their young children. And that, you know, we're seeing a rise in kind of the development, international development industry, arise in sort of interventions into parenting as one kind of strategy for reforming families. So thirdly, and relatedly to this, strategies for school success often involved assimilating the cultures of educational consumption of the dominant middle classes in India. In particular, sending young children to low-fee English medium primary preschools, including those with boarding facilities, was seen as desirable so that children would not be influenced by the village environment. Through both coded and explicit casteism, parents express concern about their children picking up bad habits from a perceived lack of cleanliness, discipline, and literacy in the village. And with caste domination explicitly shaping everyday life in Gajwa, participation in a differentiated market of early childhood education was another way in which caste class stratifications was being reproduced. So early childhood development has become a major priority of global development. Target 4.2 of the Sustainable Development Goals makes clear the instrumentalism behind these concerns. So it states by 2030, countries should ensure that all girls and boys should have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that children are ready for primary education. The notion of school readiness from educational psychology has gained significant traction within global development discourses and arguably has narrowly framed early childhood development in terms of the priorities of the institution of schooling. We see this through the publication of reports such as UNICEF's School Readiness and Transitions, as well as its more recent report on A World Ready to Learn. So the whole notion of early childhood gets indexed, if you like, to success in school. In broad terms, school readiness refers to the state of child competencies at the time of school entry that are important for later success. This is one of the kind of working definitions of school readiness. However, there is little consensus within educational psychology about the constitutive components and theoretical underpinning of the concept. Nevertheless, it appears within formalized frameworks, enshrining normative relations between schools, families, and children. And so, for example, UNICEF puts forward a model of ready schools, ready children, and even ready families to suggest that each dimension, and this is a quote, would be considered ready when they have gained the competencies and skills required to interface with the other dimensions and support smooth transitions. UNICEF defines ready families as having educational goals, beliefs, attitudes, and commitments, and a supportive learning environment in the home, specifically parental engagement with singing, reading books, telling stories, and playing games. And this is echoed within national policy statements in India too. The 2014 National Early Childhood Care and Educational Curriculum Framework emphasizes the need for families to provide supportive parenting and a stimulating home environment and be sensitized to enroll their children in school. And in the fuller paper, we examine the kind of material assumptions behind these notions of the good parent and the good family. But I think for the purpose of this analysis today, I just want to highlight, I think it's important to note that the aggressive privatization of education, including early childhood education, has meant that the ready family is one who's ready to purchase educational goods and services to be good consumers. So how poor rural families navigated the norms of school readiness through their strategies for early childhood education became a key focus of our research, which I'll share with you now. So the qualitative research that is largely based on participant observation and interview research that this presentation is based on took place in a village we're calling Gajwa, which has an approximate population of 2,800 people. It's in Kora block of the district of Katihar, in rural Bihar. And for those of you who might not be so familiar, Bihar is one of the most economically disadvantaged states in India. The research focused on three early childhood education centres, nursery centres, if you like, which are called Anganwadis in the village, which operated under the government's Integrated Child Development Services scheme. As well as, so we focused on 3 of these Anganwadis, these nurseries, as well as a low-fee private English medium school, which we're calling AJ International School. Its real name had a sort of similarly cosmopolitan outlook as well, which was just on the outskirts of the village, and some children in the village attended this. So these institutions were selected as the main early childhood education providers serving the children of Gajwa. And whilst only relatively few families from the village could afford to go to that private school, the private preschool, most preschool children attended private tutoring classes that were run within the homes of local villagers. So there was also this system of shadow education, if you like, also demonstrating that downward extension of schooling into the early childhood period. The village of Gajwa was geographically divided into different hamlets or tolas by subcastes and communities. Some 42% of the population in the village were Mahidalits, who are designated as scheduled castes in India, from the Mushahar, Pasi, Turi and Dom communities. And about 10% of the population of Gajwa Santals, who were mostly agricultural labourers, officially designated as scheduled tribe. Many referred to themselves as Santal or Adivasi, and Adivasi is the collective political identification for the indigenous peoples of India. Through the influence of Hindu nationalist and Christian missionary charities in the area and a broader politics of Sanskritization, many Santals in Gajwa had converted to Hinduism or Christianity, and this becomes relevant, as you'll see in a moment. And I also wanted to say a little bit more about the Mahidalits, who represented the largest proportion of the village, is that, against an ongoing history of caste oppression and educational exclusion, these Mahidalit communities were mostly landless daily wage labourers, and they lived in visible poverty. Okay, so what did school readiness look like in practice? How did these norms get negotiated within the village context? I'm going to propose here that one way in which school readiness was understood, it was as learning to sit and learning to write. Families in Gajwa were, like anywhere, actively socialising and teaching their children, relaying complex skills relating to life and livelihood. Children as young as 6 were observed routinely involved in makana harvesting, fishing, weaving, farming, cooking, trading, sibling care, tending to animals, as well as playing. However, the knowledge and pedagogies that underpinned these activities, that is, the learning that took place outside of formal institutions, was not seen as relevant to become ready for school, nor to succeed in the modern economy. The cultures and lessons of the home were regularly described as distinct to that of schools, with parents emphasising the need for formal institutional education in early childhood. Within the school readiness framework, marginalised families were not seen to have the relevant skills and knowledge to educate their own young children. So we have Sheila Devi Bhagat here, who's a mother of 3, who says, "In this world, education is most needed, is it not? Without education, can a person get anywhere? That is why getting education is very important. So the child learns the culture and becomes educated. The family can only teach children family values, how to bring them up or mould them, but the teacher's job of teaching can only be done by the teacher, not the parents." Sheila often emphasised the importance of early literacy instruction, and despite being literate herself with a bachelor degree, her distinction between what parents and teachers could impart to children echoed the idea that early childhood education was a specialised field that relied on expert knowledge. And this might well, people might agree with that here. For many families in Gajwa, these distinctions, however, entrenched and sometimes internalized casteist ideas. For example, Kanti Devi, a 40-year-old Mushahar Mahidalit woman with a 5-year-old daughter who attended one of the Anganwadis, described, In our community, most of us are illiterate, so how could we teach our children? We know nothing. The dehumanizing effects of caste oppression, regularly enforced by states and development agencies through administrative language, such as backward, illiterate, uneducated, meant that families in Gajwa were having to struggle against such deficit frameworks as they navigated the demands of school readiness. So this gets translated as this, overriding need of young children having to sit to learn to sit and learn to write. Oh, I'm sorry, that one of the quote actually that I put on the slide doesn't say that, but there was a direct quote of a parent saying that the children need to learn to sit and learn to write. So this is why many actually ended up turning to the private tuitions, because there was an overriding feeling that the Anganwadis, the state-led early childhood education centres, were not imparting this sort of version of school readiness. They were not seen as functional. They were mostly seen as a means to sort of daycare and to get a midday meal provision. So actually the real learning it was happening in the private tuition. So parents were looking at these private offerings, and so there was this kind of burgeoning market around early childhood education. The other way that school readiness operated, we argue, is as a form of caste-class distinction. In the context of an expanded market of early childhood education services and centres, as well as the private tuition, the Reddy family was arguably being drawn into participating in a highly differentiated, stratified system of ECE. In Gajwa, early childhood education had become a means for creating caste-class distinctions and enacting what Leela Fernandez has called the hegemonic aspirations of educational consumption of the middle classes in India. This was often expressed by parents in terms of their desire for children to learn English or Hindi as the language of the dominant classes, and to seek preschool education that would separate children from the so-called lower caste class communities. And so there was quite an emphasis on the idea that villages had bad habits, there was a lack of discipline, an explicit kind of idea of wanting to keep away from a dirty village environment, and ideas that particular languages and cultures were backward. And so this was seen, keeping away from these so-called environments was seen as crucial for doing well educationally. Parents mentioned that children learn a new culture by attending private school, and so strong was the desire from some families for children to leave the village environment that they would look to residential boarding schools for children as young as 5 and 6. And Kamala here says she's a mother of a 5-year-old who attends AJ International School, the low-fee private school in the village. The more time he spends in school and tuition, the more time he'll be away from children in the village who don't go to school. So here we see how families are navigating ECE as a crucial high-stakes part of their children's education. Family readiness at times involved being ready to send young children away out of the village environment in order to secure caste-class advantages. And as I just now turn to discuss, through both explicit and subtle forms of discipline, young children in Gajwa were being socialized into both academic and caste-class norms of schooling, often in ways that belied the norms of developmentally appropriate practice. Learning discipline, we suggest, was also a means of making oneself school ready. So here we talk about
5 minutes.
School readiness as social discipline. So discipline was seen as a legitimate pedagogic advice for academic learning, and parents would regularly describe fear and corporal punishment as a necessary and normal part of education. To be school ready, parents expressed that preschool-aged children needed to learn the disciplinary codes of schooling, and this was a key rationale for seeking institutional forms of early childhood education. As Kamala, a mother of 5-year-old Manav, explained, we cannot teach children at home. If parents teach with love and affection, then the child will not listen. That's why we have to send them to school. There is fear in children at school, because of which they study. Formal learning environments were not only seen to be more effective in imparting academic knowledge, but also in helping children internalize a kind of social respectability. A number of families explain that private schools in particular taught good social behaviour and discipline, and many aspire to enrol their children in private preschools for this reason. And I think it's really important to remember that we are talking about 5- and 6-year-old children here. Okay, so the principal, or chairman actually, as the title is, of the AJ International School, was an entrepreneur who had previously owned a molasses transportation business in a neighbouring state, and like many who run such private schools in India, had no formal training in education. He explained that poor families understood it was important for children to come to schools such as his, not only to learn reading and writing, but also how to behave in society. There was a lot of sort of implicit language and sometimes explicit language around the kind of need for respectable caste class behaviours. The principal went on to say that children in his school learnt manners like wishing children good morning, wishing teachers good morning, and the first few months were really spent socialising young children before moving on to writing ABC, as he says. And so he says that the village children needed to be disciplined because they come from uneducated environments. And he says that parents at his school, most hadn't been to school beyond the 10th standard, had frequently expressed to him that it was important for their children to catch up to the educated classes. And I think, getting at this idea that I think a couple of people have mentioned, that sort of internalized shame, or the ideas of shame around poverty, and perhaps child poverty in particular. Something that one of the participants in our study talked about really struck us. This is from Sohan Soren, a 35-year-old Santhal father whose 5-year-old son attended this low-fee private school that I've just talked about. And here we see how children needed to access, internalize or embody dominant caste class codes as a means of becoming ready for social and educational success. And Sohan Soren, who is an Adivasi father, says once they've gotten rid of the habit of Santhal, of his own culture, of Santhal way of life, children can get educated well. And he sort of goes on to tell us, if you teach using the Hindu way of life, then the child will get educated. Okay, so there is this, I suppose, it's a complex literature, but I think, perhaps it's been explored through the notions of internalized racism and so on. So, and I think this is something that we can start to see here. So just to very quickly conclude, some concluding thoughts. Here we're seeing how there are interlocking dynamics of casteism and capitalism vis-a-vis the marketization of education that are shaping norms and strategies in early childhood education. School readiness, we're arguing, bolsters this downward pressure of schooling into early childhood, leading to developmentally inappropriate practices. And policy narratives on education in early childhood need to attend to how their norms are implicated in sustaining harmful and unequal systems. And I'm really reflecting on this today as we've seen the launch of a new What Works hub by the government. So it was interesting that, in Carl's talk, he mentioned What Works as well. Rarely attended to in these ideas, in these discourses of what works, are those normative assumptions that are actually that play a very key role in sustaining harmful and inequitable systems. And I think we're seeing this across the field of education and international development as we try to find neat policy solutions without thinking about these systems of oppression, namely casteism and capitalism. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Arati, for yet another important, interesting, vital work that really questions or goes to the core of many of our questions by highlighting a specific situation. This is in India. I have a general question And that refers to the actual concept of school readiness. As I've seen it used in other contexts where it didn't seem to be so problematic, or I did not assume it was problematic. I saw it in the context of civic readiness, of schools aiming to prepare children to be civic participants. And I was wondering whether the context here, it was in an ideal position about the role of education in relation to equality concerns in the United States. So a completely different context. And yet it did seem to be used in a way that for me was positive. We see it used here in a way that is leading to the reproduction of substantive inequalities, possibly the internalization of racist views, and also a separation from, concepts of the young child and the importance of that phase in life where one hasn't got to be ready to do anything but play, perhaps, according to some like me. And I come from a European country where you don't start formal schooling until 6. So I wonder whether you had any thought about how, concepts can be used differently in different contexts and therefore assume also different connotations. Just a few words, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that there is a study to be done to really trace quite closely the travels of this discourse of school readiness across from, where it starts to emerge in the research literature to how it gets used in global education, policy frameworks and statements and so on. Because, from my reading into this, I mean, talking to educational psychologists, where this sort of idea is sort of first located, there is a really reflexive understanding that it is a contested concept. But by the time it appears in these big statements by UNICEF and the reports and trying to put forward these normative frameworks for how, like what works in schools and how we need to intervene in schools, that contestation, the complexities of the idea gets reduced, well, it disappears. And actually, I can't find the quote right now, but in our paper we cite it in that UNICEF report. The focus on school readiness in terms of particular habits, orientations, and dispositions of individuals, whether it's parents or children, leads to statements like a child is ready if they have developed a spiritual and moral orientation to, and even a national, it was termed in sort of a national orientation. And so in a country like India, where we have, rising Hindu nationalism, where we have, extraordinary, exclusion, ethnic exclusion, I think there is, these sorts of slippages are really quite concerning. And I'm sure perhaps they don't mean anything, because honestly, who takes notice of these global frameworks anyway? But what we start to see is that you get an idea that becomes loaded, absolutely loaded.
Thank you, Arathi. Thank you. I have a question from Judith, and then we might open up and bring all our contributors, excellent, wonderful contributors, together to interact and consider questions from the audience. Judith, a question specifically for Arathi, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you kind of touched on this when you were responding to Lorella, and it has to do with the global context, but I'm also really curious about whether you can say something about alternative educational frameworks that are resisting this kind of narrative. And I'm really struck by the parallels between what you were describing in the Indian context, which was fascinating, and what I think is going on here as well with the concept of school readiness and the kind of grip it has on already existing inequalities of class and race and so on. And so I'm just wondering whether there is a resistance to that. I mean, I'm aware of some alternative education projects in India, but is it possible to resist it? And how much is this part of a broader movement to do with resisting narratives of development and globalization within that kind of much bigger, you know, capitalist framework that you were alluding to.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, so so there is, of course, resistance to these, you know, dominant models of schooling that we see. But there's also pushback by the state, because under the Right to Education Act, the idea of alternative schooling, there's all sorts of norms placed on schools that they have to meet by the state, that actually the existence of alternative education that gets recognized by the state becomes harder and harder to achieve. So actually it has become harder for schools to be doing different kinds of things, or looking not like a school, right? So to be experimenting in different ways. So I think what this is doing is closing down our vision of what's possible in schooling. Where you do see, so there are absolutely kind of you know, bottom up, for lack of a better word, movements to rethinking education, schooling, sorry. But where I think we see the most recognized push, it's not so different to this country, perhaps, is in the middle class's sponsorship of child-centered education. So, you know, but this then becomes this huge market. So you know, every second school in middle-class urban areas gets the kind of Montessori label. Whether or not they're actually doing that is another question. But you do see that there is this desire to move beyond the kind of strictures or rigidities of schooling. But that is something that is accessed by the middle classes, not the poor. We have here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arathi, for your discussion, your brilliant presentation. And I would like to read Gary's comment here on the chat to conclude your illuminating session. Children don't need to be school ready. Schools need to be ready for children. And I think that's a wonderful conclusion, if you like, a comment to conclude your wonderful contribution to our seminar. Now, we have about 20 minutes, and I think it's a good time for us to reconvene and think together about all the themes that have emerged from today's wonderful presentations. I have a question that I overlooked in the chat and is directed to Carl. And I wonder whether we could start this plenary with that question, and then perhaps intersect our discussions. Again, Gary says, thank you, Carl, for this vital work. I was wondering if, when attitudes to poverty change among teachers and local communities, what then? How does this lead to making things any better? Slightly provocative question, but an important one to kick off our debate. Carl.
It's a good question, isn't it? There's two approaches to that. I think, first of all, what I'm really interested in this, and I didn't maybe get a chance to say, is part of my interest is in the intervention and the implementer. So I'm from my background in social and emotional learning particularly, and the whole idea that there could be universal models of that, I'm very interested in how we implement models and the interventor of the model. So in terms of attitudes towards poverty, one of the things we wanted to understand was these schools are doing lots of off-the-shelf interventions. Those interventions might, you know, what is the implementation process of those interventions if they are being implemented by staff who hold deficit and negative views towards families in poverty? And would that intervention be done differently by someone who held less deficit views? So that's one question that we were quite interested in trying to understand. And, you know, we're a long way off understanding that, but we are on the road to understanding that. The second part of that question, I guess, this is where the philosophy, I think, comes in, because it takes me into it takes me into very sensitive and very wary waters, because once you start measuring attitudes, the question has to be why, doesn't it? Why are you measuring attitudes? And if you are measuring attitudes, will there come a time where certain attitudes are correct and other attitudes aren't? So what would have happened if, when we'd done that attitude survey, we'd have found that 90% of staff held deficit models or understandings of poverty? I don't have answers to this, and I think about it a lot, because I think about my position and my privilege as an academic and a university researcher, working in schools and communities of high disadvantage and poverty. And then it's, and it taps into some of the conversations that have been happening today. So it's, I hold ideas of utopia. I don't hide my positionality regarding my politics, but they come from me and they come from my positionality. And I have real questions around exploring attitudes and what we find and what we do with that. I don't have simple answers to those questions. I think they need very careful thought, because, of course, one of the things that happens in this process is that lots of people say, but what we do in education is neutral. And my response to that is, it's never neutral. That's always my response. It's never neutral. Politics is part of the education process. But can there be, I really struggle with notions of right and wrong in this. I really struggle with binary ideas within this and simplistic, I don't want to turn all teachers into socialists. That's not my job, and how dare I do that? But I also want to open the social imagination to new ideas of doing things and new ideas of seeing community and new ideas of seeing spaces. But again, I'm trying to do that in a place where I have a job that allows me to do that. I'm not doing that in a place where I hold down 3 jobs and I'm struggling to make ends meet.
Can I just add to that in relation to the implementation of policies? The policies themselves, of course, need to be well constructed. And that's a completely different and important point. But a parallel might be seen with the concept of inclusion, and particularly in relation to the inclusion of students with disabilities and special educational needs. Studies have researched the importance of teachers' attitudes to conceptions of inclusions and also in the policies of inclusion, and how these have an effect on the actual inclusion or the levels of teaching that is differentiated and attentive to individuals' different needs. So there might be, and there certainly will be, something very important in what the attitudes of teachers are towards some of the policies and how these are then implemented. I just wondered whether there are other questions or comments that the panelists or the presenters, because this is not a roundtable, but would like to make. I think that Jenny might have a question, because I see a hand raised. Am I right, Jenny?
You're right, yeah. Yeah, thanks. I was just trying to think about all the what we've just heard, and earlier on Elaine said something tantalizingly about talking about a different kind of metric of justice, and I kind of wanted to give her a chance to say something about that, but I specifically was thinking about it in relation to whether your metric of justice has anything to say to the very persuasive critiques that Arati and Judith have raised in these different areas.
Thanks, Jenny. And I've been thinking of that myself in relation to both Arati, Judith, and Carl's points. I mean, the way in which we've approached this in relation to thinking about gender equality in education and developing a metric that is responsive to local conditions but also has some traction on educational, national and global education policies, has been to draw on the capability approach and to draw on kind of participatory discussions about what should be measured and why. So that that might, and I hope does, talk to Carl's you know, local matters, the only way is down, but also, you know, the picture Arathi paints of a huge dominance of racist ideas, and that it's so hard to escape from dominant discourses. So the presence, I guess, of the activist, I think there was a comment in the chat to you, Carl, about could there be, you know, there's a special role of the outsider in the in kind of widening the scope of the discussion, that you might be playing a very particular role because in Arathi's example, the village is so closed in on itself. The traveller community you were showing was so, for reason, you know, has to survive in a particular way and formulates its identity in a particular way. So there's a kind of communication between the outsider, but to develop these metrics by participatory discussion. The 6 areas in our gender equality and education framework identify resources which are often formulated by objective detail. How much money does a school have? How much income do people have in a particular area? Values. So what is valuable? Community identity is very valuable to the Roma community and is highly, in Arathi's example, highly the scheduled caste identity is highly contested. People value it and yet feel that it's something dirty and they have to get rid of it. So, but anyway, you need to discuss on that. What are the values that are driving your metric? Then the constraints, which could be the welfare system, it could be the policy system, it could be how many teachers you have, etc., etc. Then the opportunities, what's going on in school. Then what people actually learn, which might be learning to read and write, but it might be many other things about how to live in the community. And lastly, outcomes. So we're kind of, we've suggested those 6 areas as ones that need to be looked at. You need to connect the education policy with the social policy, with values, and whether that helps shift, I mean, is always going to depend on local histories and local politics and local alliances and where you're going. That's just my tentative answer to Jenny. I have a very, very specific question to the philosophers here, because what works, as Arathi showed you, is so massive in international development discourse. And it's become detached, or no one in international development, I think, traces the roots of those ideas back to Dewey and Pierce and American pragmatism. And I just wondered if there was something from what you know about the history of those ideas that could be illuminating to us in relation to work on poverty, work on thinking about the school, etc. Sorry, that's a huge thing to be throwing at you.
Anyone willing?
I mean, I could say something about Dewey and American pragmatism. I think it's misleading to suggest that there's anything to do with the what works discourse in policy. I mean, I don't know a lot about education, international development, but in other policy areas, and the spirit of American pragmatism as embodied in Dewey. So because Dewey's concern was very much with the point that moral and political questions, philosophical questions, aren't just out there in the ether. They're not perennial questions. They emerge from our real life political social context. And the problem with the what works discourse is that there's an already existing, I think, normative standard of, say, educational success or, economic growth or whatever it might be. And what works is judged according to that, which is imposed from the outside. It's not something that's emerged from a particular context. So I don't think Dewey would really have much time for that kind of notion of what works. But I can't speak to the intellectual history of where it comes from. Lorella might.
That's so interesting too is because the sort of thing Carl is describing seems much more in that spirit.
Absolutely.
I mean, because it is working in relation to how teachers feel and how local education officials were feeling and those sorts of things. But that's not the sense of what works that Arathi was.
Yeah.
So.
And also what Carl was explaining has a lot to do with the experiential element as well, which might talk a little bit more to the pragmatism in Dewey, rather than, a self-confined recipe that you apply irrespective of the context. If there are no more comments on this massive thing, Arathi, yes, because then I've got something from the chat. Arathi, please.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to go back to the question that we're discussing about Elaine's idea of metric of justice. And it's just something that I keep thinking about is in the field of education and international development, the site of intervention, the site of reform is always the global south. It's always the poor child, it's always the poor family, it's even parenting practices and so on. And I'm wondering, Elaine, have you been playing with the idea of what it would, how this metric of justice might look like if it was to be applied to, the UK's own development activities? What might a metric of justice look like for us? And I think I'm also inspired by something that is in the chat. I think Jack has mentioned about how we ourselves as academic researchers need to reflect on the kind of projects and ideologies that we embody and engage in. And so, that kind of a reflexive metric of justice, onto ourselves and onto the kinds of industries that we're enmeshed in.
Well, it's precisely that I think we need to be doing. We need to be applying it to our own institutions. We need to be applying it to the organizations that we pay tax for. And we need to, be mindful, I guess, of the things, the experiential things that Carl was talking about. Because Judith, sorry, just to be throwing ideas out, and I know Jack's point is really important to go to, but Judith, the experience, I was thinking about George Orwell as another Eton graduate who actually experienced poverty. I mean, that kind of pain of poverty, and that, but the conclusion he comes to is actually quite a bitter one about the state, and
Done out in Paris and London.
Yeah, but when he he's very critical about state-imposed solutions, I guess. I mean, his politics is because of a whole range of experiences he had, and anyway, we don't want to get into just discussing George Orwell and the kind of volume of his work, because I think Gary and Jack have both posted really interesting questions which should take us to Lorella.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. We will keep those thoughts floating around alive in our conversation future. We've got 4 minutes, and I wouldn't want to keep people here. But yeah, there's a conversation going on from Jack and Gary here. Jack noted that I think this, I mean, he noted the contempt, if you have had time to read the chat, the contempt that some teachers seem to show for towards children in abject states of poverty, and perhaps Carl's intervention has actually addressed that to a certain extent. And then Jack goes on to, I think this should also be something, he says, that academic researchers reflect on in terms of how and who can they speak for, and the often self-serving projects, ideologies that they often tacitly embody and are engaged in creating or perpetuating. Something that has been picked by Gary when he says, makes me think about Darren Garvey's book, Poverty Safari, something that we risk as researchers, but need to resolutely avoid. Perhaps we need to be activists, as Carl mentioned, instead of mere observers, analysts. Quite a challenge for the philosophers, or for some philosophers here, I guess, to be activists. So I wonder whether, you know, there are comments about this, and I would like just to kick a very provocative one. I've always responded to critiques of coming from disabled activists that only disabled people can actually speak about questions of disability with appropriateness, that should perhaps be questioned, that, you know, that there are important elements that someone who is not disabled can contribute to, as much as, you know, not only bankers should be talking about banking matters, and we've seen what happens when that happens. So I just throw that out, and I see that Carl might have something to say, and I'm open to you all to contribute to these final thoughts. Final just because of time, because they're not final. Carl.
There's just two very quick points. First of all, one of the things that emerged from our research was, very interestingly, is actually teachers talking about other staff that was really interesting. So it wasn't just teachers talking about the community, it was teachers talking about teaching assistants and how teaching assistants talked about teachers. There was a real discourse there around the teaching assistants saw the teachers as being wealthy, and the teachers saw the teaching assistants very complicatedly as living in the local community but not representing the local community, that they'd got out of the local community, that they'd escaped. And that was really, really, you know, there's some really complicated stuff in there. The other thing I think as well is you know, it's been touched upon a lot today, obviously, the words that we use. And one of the things I've been doing a lot is talking about how we talk about poverty. And I'm very uncomfortable with the juxtaposing of poverty with food poverty or fuel poverty. You know, I try and talk about economic poverty, because I think, again, that sometimes when we talk about poverty, there's a danger that we're blinding ourselves to universalizing it and objectifying an experience that is only one part of a person. You know, I meet many families in my work who are living in poverty, economic poverty, but they might not be living in cultural poverty. They might not be living in fuel poverty. They might not be living in many other versions of fragmentations of poverty. And again, I think that needs complicating. I think it needs thinking about more. That's my input, really.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. Is there anything else that you as presenters would like to share? And I would like also to draw your attention to Jack's further comments, and also to another comment that Arathi very kindly reproposed from the chat and that I had overlooked, and my apologies to the person I overlooked, Riordan. Is there anything else that you would like to add as a concluding comment, just because it is 5 o'clock? Concluding in that sense, concluding the session. Elaine, would you like to start?
Well, I guess I'm interested to, I like Carl saying economic poverty you know, don't divert from economic poverty, but I don't want economic poverty to be only money, because it's lived in so many different ways. Economic poverty is that harsh experience, and if that word conveys it, but I mean, that would be the reason to develop a metric that conveys all the harshness of economic poverty and why it's an injustice to oppose.
I don't have any profound closing comments, but just to say thank you to everyone. It's been a really rich and engaging discussion, so thank you.
Okay, well, I would like, on behalf of the audience and together with the audience, to thank you all very much. Elaine, Judith, Carl, Arathi, this has been a great session, and some very positive comments there in the chat. Surely lots of ideas to revisit, reconsider, link back to our previous seminars, bring forward to our concluding roundtable on the 3rd of June. And I'm inviting you very warmly to attend that concluding roundtable. And a most sincere thank you to all of you. Again, our brilliant presenters and our brilliant audience for making this event so thrilling. Thank you. I hope to see you all on the 3rd of June from what will be our concluding seminar in the series. Thank you again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Wow, that went well.
Yeah, thanks, Arathi. It was so much to think about.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
I'm still trying to get my head around all the comments and questions, because I think there's so much more that we could have carried on talking about. Yeah.
Yes, it was really difficult to shut you down, but I had to stay within the time.